Ukraine announces new mobilizations. The Russia-Ukraine war continues with no real end in sight. The World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland runs from January 14th to January 19th, and the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky presents his 10-point peace plan to leaders in Davos later this week prior to the start of the WEF. This proposal has no chance of a peace breakthrough, and there will be no Russian attendance or representation at Davos. The West has privately expressed concerns in the hope to induce Ukraine to reassess its willingness to conduct peace talks and to reconsider its war aims. This is as the West is facing political headwinds, making it more difficult to continue supporting the war in 2024 at the same levels of 2022 and 2023. The West does admit that pursuing peace talks is up to Ukraine, but Ukraine has not moved from its position of the 10-point plan. This means that both Russians and Ukrainians are open 2024 with continued conscription call-ups to support the war. Casualty figures are hard to confirm as it is accepted that Russia undercounts their casualties and Ukraine does not publish theirs at all. The estimated casualties as of August 2023 was that the war had cost 500,000 casualties with 300,000 Russians and 200,000 Ukrainian casualties. That includes 120,000 Russians and 70,000 Ukrainians killed. The numbers, though older, do tell us something about the war. First, the high death-to-wounded ratio demonstrates that rapid battlefield casualty evacuations from the field to the hospital is lacking. This negatively impacts morale. The other that is Ukraine is suffering significantly fewer casualties, but not a sufficient ratio to compensate the Russian manpower advantage that is 3-1 over Ukrainians. This means that the Ukrainians are winning in the casualties inflicted and demonstrating more battlefield lethality, but the Russians are winning the attritional war, which will determine the ultimate victory in this war. That's if no peace is pursued. The Ukrainian armed forces, including the reservists and paramilitary, is estimated to be 1 million personnel, with about half deployed in the combat front line. The other half are not on the front lines, can be considered non-battlefield roles, training, and frontline rotation to quiet sectors. The current mobilization strategy in Ukraine is to call up enough enlistees to stay ahead of the casualties. This policy has changed when Ukraine announced an intention to call up 500,000 new conscripts over the next few months, and this is well beyond what is needed to maintain current strength. The Ukrainians' reason for this is unclear, but it could be an indication that it has suffered greater casualties than what is being speculated. Considering the population demographic disadvantage that Ukraine has when compared to Russia, would indicate a need to keep the Ukraine casualty figures secret. If the reason is to call up so many enlistees that are 50% above the current need to fill the higher than expected casualties, why would Ukraine make the call up of 500,000 public? That would be telegraphing casualties that they have been keeping secret and would be an advantage to the Russians that their attritional strategy is working. It is doubtful Ukraine would make such an obvious message to the Russians. The other possible reason is that as Western support declines and Ukraine wants to prevent any Russian advance, it will need more soldiers to make up the loss of lethality due to the reduced Western support. The only short-term option for Ukraine is to increase manpower in the field to compensate. This makes sense from the economic perspective, land, labor, capital, and would align with the Soviet thinking, which Ukraine was a member, that quantity is a quality all its own. This reasoning could be possible, but can it be expected that the Ukrainians will use these numbers judiciously? Increasing the manpower density on the front line can help repel attacks, but also increases the likelihood of higher casualties, especially from artillery. The current battlefield situation in Ukraine is one of static warfare, and artillery dominates in this type of warfare. Ukraine will have to greatly increase the frontline static fortifications to keep the increased manpower from becoming casualties if Russia relies on artillery to inflict casualties while minimizing its own. The most likely reason, though, is that above the two reasons, though the above two reasons could have some validity for secondary reasons, is that the Ukraine is attempting to match the exceeded to match and exceed the recently announced Russian call-up. Russia announced that it will call up 170,000 enlistees in the coming months to augment the 1.3 million personnel in its armed forces. This Russian number would be enough to keep ahead of casualties and in the inevitable discharges that are occurring. Ukrainians are signaling that it is calling up 3 times as many as the Russians. The current lines have solidified, and the Russian call-up is being considerably smaller than Ukraine call-up. Most likely means that Russians will lack the resources to displace the Ukrainians with such a large call-up. The Russian armed forces not only have to operate in Ukraine, but must operate throughout the country, including the NATO-facing lines in the Baltic regions. Russian President Vladimir Putin is running for re-election in March and is expected to easily win re-election. One of its goals for the re-election would be to achieve a complete victory over the Ukraine and the Donbass, which is the territories of Luhansk, Donetsk, and Zaporizhzhia. Occupation of these regions is a war aim of Russia, as he has declared these regions to be part of Russia now, and taking these prior to the election, or at least in 2024, would open the way for Russia to, quote, declare peace as its aims for the war will be achieved. Russia would also like to do so without taking excessive casualties, which could tip the support for the war in Russia if they have additional casualties. The addition of 500,000 Ukraine troops would mean that Ukraine plans on holding these regions and extracting a heavy cost on the Russians. The Ukraine strategy to call up so many enlistees, though it will be unpopular and strain its economy and social cohesion, could be a strategy to keep Ukraine in the war and to keep Russia from declaring the war at an end and denying Russia of its territorial goals. The non-territorial goals of changing the Ukraine government and installing a government friendly to Russia seem to be out of reach to the Russians, or at least out of reach for the cost in men and material the Russians are now willing to pay. If the Ukrainians can defeat the Russian goals in the Donbass and prevent them from declaring victory, it is hoped it would incentivize the Russians to compromise for peace, or, more likely, reinvigorate flagging Western support. If it does not work, Ukraine could have gambled its long-term physical and economic security.